Hello, it's Mr. Moeller for lesson 4-4, graphing functions. Alright, so in this lesson we kind of have two things we need to do, but they're really kind of the same thing. So we need to graph functions on a limited domain. So what that means, that's actually easier than graphing them on an unlimited domain. So they're going to give us the x value, and we plug it in, do the math, and then graph the points once we get the y value. Graphing function given a domain of all real numbers, that means we have to pick the domains, which then could be a little more difficult depending on the kind of graph. And then we just do the same thing, plug them in, and get our answer. All right, so a little more difficult than when we did this in chapter 1. So some of them might not be set up to graph. So we need to make sure we get the y by itself. We make an xy table, write in our x's, substitute the x's so that we get our y's, and then we make a graph. Okay, and just as a reminder, if you have something with an x to the first power or x to, there's nothing there, it's going to be a straight line. If you get something with an x to the second power, it's going to have a U shape. And remember, if we graph absolute value, we're going to get a V shape. Okay, so something like this. Okay, so we are graphing x squared minus 3, and they're giving us the x's. So this is a little easier. We have to do a little less thinking because we're really just plugging them in and seeing what the graph looks like. Okay, once again, it's an x squared, so it should end up looking like a U. So as long as we have a calculator, we should be able to do this. So if I plug in -2, so -2 squared is 4, 4 minus 3 is 1. So I'm going to be graphing -2, 1. And then the same thing as I keep going down. If I put in -1, -1 squared is 1, 1 minus 3 is -2, so I'm graphing -1, -2. Okay, and that would go so on and so on as I keep going down. So then this is what my graph would end up looking like. So all those domains, and here's my U shape that I would get. Okay, something like this ends up being a little more difficult because, like I said, that's step number 2 that we just reviewed. We need to make sure that y is by itself. And as I can see, it does not say y equals. It says -2x plus y equals. Okay, so this is going to be a little more difficult because I need to get that y by itself. So again, going back to chapter 2 now, how do I get that -2x to go to the other side? Well, I need to add 2x. So now once I add 2x to both sides, this is going to cross off, and I just add 2x to the other side. So now I have y equals +2x plus 3. And now I can do those steps. Okay, and again, it gave us the domain. It gave us what it wanted us to plug in for the x's. So I can just plug it in. So I wanted -5. So I plug in 2 times -5 is -10. -10 plus 3 is -7. So I'm graphing -5, -7. Same thing, I'll do one more. 2 times -3 is -6. Plus 3 is -3. So -6 plus -3, or -6 plus +3 is -3. Again, it's x to the first power, so this should end up looking like a straight line once I graph it. And there it is. Okay, there's my straight line. Kind of the same thing here. Y is already by itself, but they didn't give us any of the domains. Okay, so let's pretend that those are not there. Okay, so they didn't give us any. I say you need to pick at least 3 until you get a shape, until you see what the pattern's going to be. Okay, that's why it's important that we know what shape it's going to be so we know what we're looking for. Here, I see x to the first power. There's no x to the second power. There's no absolute value. So I know it's going to be a straight line. So really, I could be done after these first 3. Okay, so if I plug in -3 times -2 is +6. 6 plus 2 is 8. I'm graphing -2, 8. If I plug in -1, -3 times -1 is a +3. 3 plus 2 is 5. If I plug in 0, -3 times 0 is 0. 0 plus 2 is 2. Okay, and I can graph those 3 points, and I would still get a straight line because it says x to the first power, not x squared, not anything like that. So it's a little more difficult because I have to think about what numbers to plug in because it didn't give us those numbers, but it's pretty much the same kind of problem. Remember, when we get something that says absolute value, so the last one we'll do after the video, is I need to figure out what makes the absolute value equal 0. Okay, so I need to figure out what makes this 0. What does x have to be in order it to be x minus 1 equals 0. The answer for that, remember, is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. And then I'm picking a number lower than 1, a number higher than 1. So really I don't need to do this -2 and -1. I could be okay just graphing the 0, the 1, and the 2. 0 minus 1 is -1. Absolute value of -1 is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Absolute value of 0 is 0. And then 2 minus 1 is 1. So I'm graphing those points. And remember, since I'm graphing absolute value, all of this should end up looking like a V.